Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical.
And
And
mine,
today my guest is Eugene Wiexel, the author of The Old Man Yells at Cloud Substack. I'm sorry, Old Man Shouting at Clouds. My apologies.
he also yells.
Well, I think I titled this on, if you'll forgive me, I think I titled this on my Substack and on YouTube and Patreon as Cranky Old Man. So
I'm also a cranky old man.
I may not quite be there yet technically, but I'm really working on it.
Well, if people think I'm a cranky old man, I'm okay with it.
I almost went with grumpy, but I didn't want to steal someone else's trademark.
Okay.
How
So
are you doing today?
I'm not too bad. I've got a decent night's sleep, and I've been looking forward to this. And I want to thank you for having me on, letting me express myself and expose my Substack, which I have difficulty getting people to see, let alone read.
I have the same problem. It was really easy when I first started, but then the social media people changed whatever they changed, and now it's like social media links to someplace else don't seem to get much in algorithms anymore.
No,
It's
well,
depressing.
I
And
think I think my post that got the most views got 50 views.
I get somewhere from 60 to 90 sometimes. I used to get like over 100 on good on what I thought were good posts, but it seems like there's a lot less engagement from Twitter since a bunch of the changes went through after Musk took over, which makes sense. He hated media, he hated independent media, he didn't like journalism, so it makes sense that it's harder to get attention for any sort of media on Twitter now, because that was one of the things he wanted to clamp down on, I imagine.
Right. Well, you have Facebook and Instagram, which is owned by Zuckerberg, who
Yep.
is emotionally a Zionist.
Yes.
I mean, you can't deny that. And Twitter, which is owned by a mentally unstable, psychologically unstable, racist fascist.
And let's not forget that he is only the quote unquote public owner. He does have a partner that everyone conveniently leaves out, which is the Saudi
That's right.
the
The
Saudi
Kingdom of
royal
Saudi.
family, basically.
That's right.
And I'm trying to think if there is a better and if there is a scarier combination for controlling social media than a deeply unstable, deeply prejudiced, deeply aristocratic and racist billionaire on the one hand and the Saudi royal family on the other. I mean, that's just such a special combination.
Well, it's
And I don't know if
it's flabbergasting.
and I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but the what's the I hate the phrase. The phrase they use is venture philanthropy, which is such a weird phrase that it almost doesn't make sense. But the venture philanthropy organization that is the major owner of the Atlantic now, the Emerson Collective, is owned and run by a trio of managing partners that consists of Laurene Powell Jobs, who's Steve Jobs' widow and put up the money for the organization, Obama's former education secretary, Arnie Duncan, and Michael Klein, who is an investment guy whose main claim to fame is that he was once the U.S. manager for the Saudi the Saudi royal family's public wealth fund.
I don't know
They
what
own the Atlantic now. And the Saudis are partners in Twitter now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, the Saudis are getting into every little bit of billionaire media.
Right. And they're, of course, underhanded supporters of Netanyahu
Yes.
and really what Netanyahu is doing in Gaza, in spite of their public pronouncements and Security Council.
Well, I know
Council.
MBS and Netanyahu were meeting a whole lot back in 2016, 2017, 2018.
Mm-hmm. And there were at least de facto allies long before that.
Yes. And of course, Netanyahu and Putin support each other in all sorts of ways. Money goes both ways between Putin's people and Netanyahu's people, which is hilarious when the media came out saying that Russia supports Hamas. It's like, if anything, there is a mutual support between the worst elements in Russia and the Likud because they mutually reinforce each other.
Well, Russia supports Hamas the same way that Saudi Arabia does.
Yeah, on paper and in public and with mealy mouth words of.
Well, actually, they don't even, because they haven't really stated that the
True, they haven't.
that the breakout from the concentration camp was justified.
And that's big. Of course, yes, it absolutely was. And the publicity around the breakup, the publicity around the breakout was just so over the top right away.
Mm-hmm.
And the actual intelligent, we're trying to pretend to be legitimate media in Israel has walked almost all of that stuff back since the first day. But it's still everywhere in U.S. media, and it still gets repeated as fact by almost everyone on the internet, and it's scary.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like to frame that breakout in terms of a film that had garnered a whole lot of praise and a few awards, which is Battle of Algiers.
Yes.
Because when you're talking about an oppressed and colonized people that are occupied, when that came out, first of all, it showed how the Front for National Liberation of Algeria did attack civilians deliberately.
Yeah.
And that in a sense it was justified.
Yes.
And at the time, back in the 60s, the whole world thought this was a fantastic, great movie.
Mm-hmm.
And that it showed a valiant struggle for freedom and independence.
And I've said this.
And I would suggest people watch that you can watch it for free on YouTube with English or Spanish subtitles.
Oh, no.
Just have to search it on YouTube, you'll find it.
And that's the Battle of Algiers, folks. I'm going to put that in the chat. To
put real context to this whole thing.
No, and that's excellent. And it's important to remember that there's a step beyond just old-fashioned European colonialism when we're talking about the colonization of Palestine too, in that Israel is a militarized state. There are two kinds of civilians in Israel. People with religious exemptions who never serve in the IDF because of their religious exemptions, and people who refuse to serve in the IDF and serve time in prison. Everybody else is either a veteran or a reservist or an active soldier.
That's right.
So, and then
unless they're physically incapable.
Yes, of course, disabled people, of course, and anybody who would be considered ineligible to serve under their medical guidelines. But then when you take the religious exemptions, not all of the religious exemptions are really civilians, because the religious exemptions includes both the Orthodox Jews who are flying Palestinian flags and fighting with Israeli cops in the oldest Jewish neighborhood in Jerusalem, but it also includes Orthodox groups that support really scary right-wing parties and have their own militias.
Right, which is the majority of the Orthodox.
Which comes to say that even when you come to the religious exemptions, a bunch of those people still aren't civilians. They're just paramilitaries instead of official military.
Yeah, and they most of them gravitated to the illegal settlements on the West Bank.
Yes, and
they never stopped waging terrorism against their Palestinian neighbors.
Never. And these are the folks who are backed by cops in the military when they throw people out of their houses, as we witnessed several times over the last several years.
Yep.
And I think it's interesting. The last time Israel attacked Gaza, and it was all over the news, MSNBC made a mistake and put some good interviews with Palestinians about what was going on the news. And people were really upset and saw that something was wrong, that it wasn't just self-defense. They were clearly shooting at Gaza for no other reason than to kill people. And of course, over the years, repeatedly, people have talked about mowing the lawn in Gaza, which is to make sure that this current generation of teenagers doesn't grow up. And
that's right.
You have to really think about that. When they say they want to destroy Hamas's infrastructure, that's why they're attacking Gaza, this is a very mealy-mouthed way of saying they want to kill everybody there. Because
kill them or push them out of.
When they say destroy the infrastructure, they're talking about human infrastructure, because they've told on themselves, where they believe that Arab women have babies and that babies grow up, and that this is part of the infrastructure that they have to dismantle. And it's okay, so you're just saying outright that when you say destroy the infrastructure, you mean genocide. And killing poets and teachers and doctors and judges. Well, that's what the Khmer Rouge did, right?
Yes.
And
they've gone after UN facilities.
They've gone after UN aid workers repeatedly. And the permanent representative to the UN justified it by getting up in front of the UN and saying with his full throat, "But the UN is Hamas."
You mean the representative of Israel?
Yes, the UN representative for Israel. He said that UN aid workers are Hamas. That UNICEF is Hamas.
That all the journalists are Hamas. That all the aid workers are Hamas.
If I had just been funnier as a kid and known about this then, I could have walked around with my little coin box and said, "Trick or treat for Hamas."
Mm-hmm. By the way, something similar to that happens in predominantly Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods in New York.
Yeah, I believe that.
You have yeshiva students walking around with collection boxes.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's really, I don't know exactly how to approach this, but the anti-Zionist ultra-Orthodox, their real complaint is the timing.
Yeah.
Because they believe that they'll take possession of Palestine
when the Messiah comes to Jerusalem
and rule the world.
Yes.
When the Messiah comes.
Well, I mean,
exactly.
And that's the promise for every religion, that the end times will come and you will rule the world and everybody will. And that's really why I have a real struggle with religion, despite growing up in a very religious family with a mom who was one of the good preachers. It's just because ultimately, it all comes down to, well, the world is going to end, but it's going to turn out well for us.
Right.
And that seems too fatalistic and too long term to really be of any help to anyone in a material sense right now. And more than that, it doesn't sound like it actually ends well for the majority of people, just a few true believers.
Right.
It makes me think of what Bakunin said in God and the State, where he said, if God were real, we would have to abolish him. And it makes me think of some of the more, what's the word I'm looking for? The more rebellious strains of rabbinical thought, where a lot of times you see a rabbi writing about what an old bastard God is, and why can't he be just a little bit nicer? Almost like an argument with God over the way the world is going.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, and I think that sort of dialogue has always appealed to me, because I'm not always convinced that if there is a God, he's actually perfect. If he were, things would be a lot better.
You reminded me of a conversation I had with a Reform rabbi when I was a taxi driver. Excuse me. I used to drive a taxi, but I used to drive a taxi at night. I did that for about 25 years in New York City. And I had this conversation with a Reform rabbi. And it was about whether God could be omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent. And he said to me, God can't be all three things.
Yeah, because if he's omnipotent and omniscient, then it's his fault.
That's exactly right. And he really couldn't cut that knot.
It's not cuttable. I mean, unless you're going to say something really mystical with, the world is imperfect and everything happens for the best in the best of all possible worlds, like the fatalists of the late 18th and early 19th century, then you can't. Either, I mean, there are three options. God exists and he's an asshole, or God doesn't exist, or God exists in some form, but not in the omnipotent and omniscient form that everyone imagines. Now, here I admit I kind of like Spinoza and get back to the idea of God is everything and everyone, and and just an expression of the universe trying to understand itself and learn about itself and explore its own existence. I think that if there is a future for religion, that it is in that pantheistic interpretation of God and not in the traditional human anthropomorphic recognition of God. But people don't seem to, people talk all the time about how they understand that God isn't a person in that sense. But in the end, all these interpretations of God come back to what the angry atheists always call Sky Daddy.
Well, if you want my opinion, it's I can't accept the notion that everything that is real, everything that exists, is here by some kind of a coincidence. I can't accept the idea that there isn't something like a divine spark that defines what's life.
I mean,
anything that's alive.
And that seems like that makes sense. There needs to be some sort of what Aristotle called the first mover.
Right.
Even
I
if
I never believed that he was wondering what this taxi driver in New York City was doing,
it,
how he could help him.
I don't think it. I don't think that. I'm trying to think. I don't even know how well I can express what I think in simple terms. I do believe that there are things that I'm trying. I believe in life and I believe in truth, and I'm not 100% sure how I believe in morality beyond life and truth. I really, on the one hand, there are things that I can see and I can say, hey, this is wrong. This is obviously wrong. Everybody should know this is wrong.
Right.
But if you remember, there's a quote from Inherit the Wind where the prosecuting attorney asks the defense attorney, Henry Drummond, does right have no meaning for you whatsoever? Does right mean anything to you? And the defense attorney replies, with the understanding that it might prejudice my case before this court, right has absolutely no meaning to me whatsoever. Truth has meaning as a direction, but it is one of the imbecilities of our age that we measure every human action by a latitude of right and a corresponding longitude of wrong. And I tend to agree with that because most people aren't good or bad. They're just trying to survive.
That's right.
And even some people that we would think of as deeply evil are still, from their point of view, just trying to survive and muddle through, even if it's extremely harmful and unproductive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to have more of an understanding of that and not, which is funny because I judge people all the time, and I should probably work on that too. But
Well, I don't know if it's possible not to judge people, regardless of what may have caused people to be what they are and what they
yeah,
do.
well, I mean, I've been reading a lot of.
At least judge their actions.
Well, yeah, because at some point you have to judge actions. Actions have consequences,
That's
and you
right.
have to judge actions by their consequences.
Right, not by intentions.
Well, I mean, I have good intent all the time, but it doesn't matter if I have good intent. If something I do hurts somebody else, they're still harmed, and my intentions don't make it better.
Well, I'm 77 years old, and I have to confess that there are times when I did not have good intentions about certain things.
I mean, I think nobody has good intentions 100% all the time.
That's right.
That's human nature. Sometimes people are angry or hurt, and they act on bad intentions, believing that they'll feel better.
Right.
And sometimes actions with bad intentions have unexpectedly good results for someone.
Right.
I don't want to undersell things that didn't necessarily have good intentions have worked. The best example I can think of, which is something I did not know until I was researching pre-1948 settlement patterns, because I wanted to see how population demographics were changing even before Israel declared itself a state. And Haifa is an interesting case study. Haifa was back in the classical in classical Judea under the Romans. Haifa was a Samaritan city. Jaffa had been a Philistine city under during the high biblical period of the books of what Christians call the books of Samuel and Kings, and it really only started to become a Jewish city after the destruction of Jerusalem, when a lot of people who had lived in Jerusalem relocated to Haifa, and it became a Jewish city then, and it remained a Jewish city until the First Crusade. And in the First Crusade, Western Christians killed everybody in Haifa indiscriminately. Jews, right. Christians, Muslims. This is the origin of of kill them all and let God sort them out. The language that the priests on the crusade used was, do what you must, for the Lord will know his own. And so they killed everybody. Anybody local, Christian, Jew, Muslim, they didn't bother to try to figure out what their religion was. And Haifa was destroyed and didn't exist for a couple of hundred years. And then was resettled under the Ottomans, where it was an Arab city, but it was a very diverse Arab city with representation from all three religions in the area, plus a very vibrant European immigrant community that was not just Jewish. And here's where some of the bad intentions come in. A Christian doomsday cult from Germany settled in Haifa in the 1870s, 1880s. And while they were there, they built the first steam power plant in Palestine. They built a whole bunch of factories that were amazing for the local economy. And they built the first sort of rudimentary mass transportation system in Palestine. They had carriage services to Tiberias and other cities in the area. And this was something that they had initially done for themselves, but it benefited the entire city. And ironically enough, it was all this development in Haifa that led Theodor Herzl, when he visited the city, to say, this is where we've got to send people. This is the place. This is the place where we can start setting up like we were in Europe because of the development.
The infrastructure.
And at the time that Herzl visited, there were like 263 Jews in Haifa, all of whom were Arab Palestinians. In 1922, Haifa had grown from about 7,000 or 8,000 people to about 20,000 people. 2/3 of which were still Arab, with a mix between all three, with a proportional mix between all three religions, and 6,000 were European settlers, specifically Zionists. The Templar that was the name of the German doomsday cult, the Templars. Their population was counted separately because they had their own settlement, but everything that they were building around their settlement was also plugging into public infrastructure and was being used by everybody else. In 1948, when Israel declared independence, at that point, the population of Haifa was almost 100,000 people, and it was 96% European settlers. And the people who built the infrastructure, this is an interesting story. In 1916, of course, the Great Arab Revolt happened. And in 1917, Lawrence of Arabia and Prince Faisal rolled into Palestine and kicked the Ottomans out. And when that happened, the Templars, of course, were German. So they were all interned as enemy aliens. And some of them were interned locally in Alexandria because that was the closest big British base. And others were sent to Australia and interned there. And after World War I, some of them were allowed to go back to Palestine. Some chose to stay in Australia, and some went back to Germany because they didn't feel safe anymore because the British were crazy, as many people have observed way back to the Spanish talking about mad dogs and Englishmen. So then they were interned again during World War II, same places again, Alexandria and Australia. And this time a larger group was interned. Almost everybody in Australia was given the choice of either staying there or being sent back to Germany. And the small number of Templars who were still living around Haifa when the Independence War ended were deported back to Germany.
I want to tell you something. I remember some time ago I suggested that you take up Robert Kennedy Jr.'s offer to debate anyone. Because of the people that I've come to know, but by way of the internet and other ways, I think you would send them packing.
I'm not very
You,
good.
you have such an encyclopedic knowledge of so many different subjects and areas.
Know where to look stuff up. I mean, I'm a librarian, not a professor. I just know where to find stuff like this, and I know.
Yeah, but you keep it in your head, and it's organized in your head. Not everybody can do that.
That's true. That makes sense. I've thought about things like that. I'm not very good at formal debate. I'm really great at argument, but not very good at debate. And honestly, well, I realize that I have everything to gain and not much to give him from it.
That's right.
I'm very leery about how I promote myself, and I think it's for a reason. I don't want to be more important than what I'm saying. And I don't want to be more important than the people I'm platforming, if that makes any sense.
It doesn't make sense to me. Because some people have certain gifts. And I think you're someone who does. And I don't think you should be afraid of getting big, of becoming big.
Well, it's not that I'm afraid of becoming big, because number one, being big seems to have bad effects on a lot of people.
Maybe that's true, but
and I would love to get more attention for what I'm saying, but I don't want to be a personality or a cult of personality either.
Well, maybe there could be some kind of happy medium, but I still think that if you gave Kennedy a spanking on the internet, it would be a springboard that then you could figure out what you want to do with it.
I'll think about that. That might be worth it.
Give it a thought.
Can't hurt.
Give it a thought. I wish I could, but I know that I can't.
I don't know if I'm not worried about being intimidated. I don't always think of things as quickly verbally as I do when I'm writing. And when I'm writing, I can take time to think and don't necessarily have to have a response right away. And saying the right thing is difficult sometimes. But it's not like Kennedy has a deep knowledge on the
Yeah, I think you could tear his ass up.
But I always found that was interesting, as there was already a significant European population around the area of Haifa when the pre-Israelis got there. That's the best way to put it, pre-Israelis. And that was one of the reasons they went there, because somebody else was already building it up and they could work off of that. But once they actually had control, those people were gone. And I think that says something about the attitude of the settler movement, that even other settlers are useful only as far as it is a beneficial to the movement, and are gone as soon as they aren't.
I don't know. How does the kibbutz movement fit into what you're saying?
Well,
I
human
think those
shield,
people imagine themselves as pioneers and they wanted to do physical work and all of that.
sure, and that's a big part of it. But again, the kibbutz movement is an interesting discussion because it ties in to the roots of the conflict between the locals, even before it became even before the war broke out, or there was any talk about Israeli independence publicly. The roots of the conflict start in the 1920s. And the fundamental root of the conflict, where everything starts, and something could have been done, but for a variety of reasons, people were thinking about their own private interests, and nobody was thinking about everyone. As settlements really started to pick up in the 1920s, at this point, it was all voluntary. Nobody was forcibly settling anything. It was landowners selling their land to Jewish immigrant groups. However, the kibbutz is a very different thing from the quasi-feudal agricultural system that was going on in Palestine before the settlers got there. It was, I don't want to say it was a one-to-one European feudalism thing, but you had a landowner, and the landowner gave rights to farmers, and the farmers worked the land and gave a percentage to the landowner under the same sort of principle as feudalism. It was the Ottoman payment in kind taxation system, but it was very similar to European feudalism as far as the model went. When they sold their farms, then what would happen is you would have a group of people move in with the decision to work the land themselves. And a lot of the peasants who were doing the actual farming didn't have anything to do anymore. Some of them got jobs teaching Israeli farmers how to farm. And it is important to understand how much the kibbutz movement owes to Palestinians who were paid agricultural consultants, to people from Russia and Poland whose agricultural background was a completely different environment. And when people talk about making the desert bloom, it's really important to understand the desert was already blooming. And the people who taught the Israeli farmers how to do all this stuff were the ones who had been making it bloom in the first place.
Right.
But because you're buying a land that's worked in by economic terms, peasants, tenant farmers rather than owner farmers, you're displacing people every time you buy a farm and turn it into a kibbutz. Those people go somewhere. Historically, and it was the same in Palestine, out of work peasants go into towns and look for what we would call normie jobs. And as tends to be the case, city people tend to look down on poor hicks. And there's a class issue as well, of course, in which bourgeois and petty bourgeois people in towns think they're better than peasants because peasants are flunkies for landowners. And so there was all sorts of social discrimination against displaced peasants when they went into towns and cities to get normie jobs. And they faced a lot of social barriers that they hadn't faced before. And Palestinian leadership started arguing about what to do about this. And it doesn't help that the two biggest families in the area were in direct political competition with each other for control, both under Ottoman and under British rule. So one of them would always side with pro-settler groups, and the other one would always side with anti-settler groups, because they would just, and it didn't matter which one sided with which side at a given time, though it generally pretty much settled down to where the family of the future Grand Mufti of Jerusalem sided with the peasants consistently, and the family that they were up against sided with the settlement movement fairly consistently, because that was where their interests ended up laying out. One wanted to sell land while the other wanted to build off of peasant dissatisfaction to create to strengthen the Arab nationalist movement. And so they started working at cross purposes in a way that made it impossible for the Palestinians to agree on anything, because you're divided. And whereas the settler movement was not divided, the settler movement was entirely pro-settler.
And their aim was to rule Palestine. Their aim wasn't, they weren't immigrants or refugees. They came there with a project.
The most important Sephardic leader in Jerusalem under the Ottoman Empire was really friendly to some of the first Polish and Russian Jews who came to Palestine. He thought they were interesting. He was really interested in the idea of Sephardic and Ashkenazic rabbis having these big meetings in Jerusalem and getting to know each other and exchanging information about history and culture. But the more he got to know actual settlers, the more concerns he had about them not necessarily liking the locals or wanting to join existing communities. And he began to become very opposed to more European settlement, because they're messing up our relationship with our Arab friends. And he was killed fighting for the Ottomans against the British in 1917. And it's interesting how much the local Jews in Jerusalem loved the idea of cultural Zionism under Ottoman control, as long as it didn't mess up their local relationships and the local economy. But they began to get really frightened of political Zionism really fast. And some of them actually left and went to what's now Turkey rather than stay, because they wanted to stay somewhere more Ottoman and not become European. Their vision for their vision was a Jewish and Muslim and Christian Palestine where everybody sort of exchanged these intellectual ideas, and then they're seeing they want to ruin all that and take over. And it's just, the conflicts are so interesting, both between the pro and anti-Zionist Arabs and between the pro and anti-Zionist Jews. And ultimately, because the settler movement was unified and the various anti-settler groups were not, the settlers just sort of had their way. And it doesn't help. This is the worst part of it too, because I think you're begging for trouble with something like this. You have Europeans whose entire cultural framework is the Pale of Settlement along what was then the Polish-Russian border and what is now Ukraine. And their entire framework for interacting with civil authorities was, well, we mind our own business until the pogrom happens, and when the pogrom happens, we fight with the authorities about getting the right recompense. This is not the right mindset if you're going someplace where you want to be where you want to integrate. This is a mindset of isolationism and conflict, where conflict is really your only means of operating with outsiders. You don't have a reference that isn't built on conflict. So every time something happened between settlers and Arabs, or even settlers and local Jews, the Zionists, the settler movement leaders would blame the Ottomans, or later the British, because of their whole framework of the government let somebody do a pogrom to put us in our place, and then we fight with them to get something back in return for it. And that wasn't the way it was supposed to work where they were going. That wasn't supposed to be the framework. It was supposed to be different. But they kept operating on this same European framework as if their neighbors were still the same Polish and Russian bigots who had been oppressing them, and that nothing had changed. And I think it's important.
That's their mentality now, too.
Yeah. Well, it's even worse now.
Yeah.
I mean, the mentality now is we can do whatever we want, and anything to stop us is just the most horrible act of cruelty ever. And it's that when the first Arab riot happened in 21 over the peasants issue, the Arabs were talking about independence. They were talking about Palestine needs to declare independence. We need to do something for our peasants. We need to unify. We need to be a people. We need to take the energy we used to put into Greater Syria and put it into a Palestinian nation for ourselves. And a group of Russian settlers who had been in Palestine for maybe 9 months, who happened to be in the audience, started throwing rocks at speakers, and a riot happened. And I think it's important to understand that moment in time when somebody arrests a 7-year-old kid in school for allegedly throwing a rock at someone. The reason that the settler movement is so intimidated by thrown rocks is they know it can all start with thrown rocks. Because that's how they started. And it's really, they're afraid of someone doing to them what they've already done.
That has a lot to do with whiteness also in this country.
Yes. Well, it doesn't help that a lot of the settlers are Americans and Russians whose Jewishness is based on a blood quantum rather than on an actual history of personal engagement with Judaism. I mean, there's going to be a difference between evangelical Christians who meet a blood quantum requirement and actual Jews on some level, I would think. Maybe I'm overthinking it too much, but at some point, if you're taking evangelical Christians because of a blood quantum issue in order to kill Palestinian Jews and take their land, are you really a Jewish state?
You've lost me.
I'm sorry. A lot of settlers especially the newer waves, Naftali Bennett's group. So not all the settlers are the people we would expect to be the settlers. When apartheid ended, a whole bunch of old line Afrikaners who didn't like the idea of Nelson Mandela being president discovered their Jewish roots and emigrated to Israel. And it's like, Did they really do that because they suddenly wanted to be Jewish after living as Christians in South Africa for 100 years? Was it really because they actually had a deep commitment to their Jewishness? Or was it because they didn't want a black president?
Right. Actually, I read about a gang of Russians who had one Jewish grandparent
Well, that's the
who were in Israel out and out Nazis.
well. So one of my ex-best friend, I say ex because it was the Palestine question that led us to stop being friends eventually. My ex-best friend is a former Soviet citizen who on the Soviet Union's nationality listing was listed as Ukrainian because her father was Ukrainian, but whose mother was Jewish. So of course she's Jewish by Orthodox standards, which is more than a lot of Russians. One of the biggest, most of the Russians who relocated to Israel after the USSR fell were again that blood quantum, one Jewish grandparent, which is the requirement for immigration to Israel and to be covered under the right of return, one Jewish grandparent, which is ironically the 1/8 rule. If anyone is familiar with American slavery.
That's right.
And so a lot of the Russian Jews in Israel, even those who do consider themselves Jewish, are discriminated against for speaking Russian or for not being Jewish enough, and are frequently required to convert if they want to be buried in Israel. But at the same time, we're happy to take them because they add to our demographics in the right way.
That's right. They're afraid of being outnumbered. And in the land between the river and the sea, they already are outnumbered.
Are you familiar with the American evangelical organization that calls itself Jews for Jesus?
Somewhat familiar.
They are heavily active in settlements. And when I talk about evangelical Christians who go to Israel to steal Palestinian land, I mean, the dirty secret is some Palestinians are Jewish, and you've got
they probably are the people that descended from the people of the Old Testament.
Well, let's talk about that, because that's actually there is an extraordinary book that was written in the 70s by 4 faculty members from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So we're talking about Jewish academics who live in Israel writing this. We're not talking about some anti-Semitic crank in the U.S. And this is the book is called A History of the Jewish Peoples plural.
Right.
Because it completely catalogs diaspora life and the history of the Jews in Palestine. What's really interesting is at the very beginning of the book, one of the things they say is this Bible stuff is probably not true. You have to understand that. This is an explanation for why we're different than everyone else, not something that the people who were spreading it believed in a literal sense. It was a story to explain their difference. A myth, if you like. The word that was used in the word that they use a lot in the book is mythohistory. And the purpose of this was that the people who would become the Israelites and eventually the Jews were runaway slaves and people who didn't like human sacrifice and bandits and a whole bunch of these other sort of social outcasts who decided, we can do better than these other folks. And proceeded to try to do so, and to give themselves a distinct identity, they adopted this very specific history of where they came from to explain why they were different than the other Canaanites. And this explains in some ways both the religious instruction to genocide and the commandment to welcome the stranger. Because on the one hand, you're supposed to take out anyone who isn't like you. But on the other hand, you're supposed to welcome anyone who agrees to be like you. And if you think of it in terms of we're accepting anyone who says they're one of us, and we're not accepting anyone who wants to do things the old way, a lot of that stuff makes more sense than it does in the literal religious sense. But what that means in the end is you have this history where all the people are the same people and they fight amongst themselves and divvy up into different political entities and intermarry and rejoin, and they're conquered by different people. And in the beginning, they're all sort of, they're never really religiously homogeneous in the first place.
Right.
There's always this struggle between what we think of as the Israelite religion of the Bible and the old Canaanite religion. It never completely goes away until the Babylonian conquest. And then when the people who would become the Jews come back from Babylon, they meet the locals who are still there and never left, the people of the land, as Ezra and Nehemiah call them. And then they immediately decide, these people aren't as good as us. We don't like them. They don't like us. We're just going to say they're not us. And you see this even more tighter division between Jews and Samaritans develop. And over time in Palestine, you have Judaism, which gets bigger and bigger for a while during the early Roman period. And then you have the destruction of Jerusalem, which spreads Jews from Jerusalem all over the rest of Palestine. And then you have, over the next centuries, a series of Christian and Islamic conversions. And, the Jews and the Palestinians are the same people. They just converted differently at different times.
A few years ago, I got one of those DNA tests, but it was with a company that claims that it's family owned and that they don't share information with insurance companies and so forth. And according to them, I'm 77% Jewish.
Sure.
And that most Ashkenazi Jews are not.
Yeah, a lot. No, there's a
that I'm part of like a 20% minority of Ashkenazi Jews.
If you think about it, it makes sense because you're going from if you're taking let's take the mindset that people are going from Palestine to Poland, and when they get where they're going, they start their own communities. You have to figure at some point there has to be a question who actually moved to Poland from Palestine and who was converted in Poland by their new neighbors.
Well, you also have in older times the human slave trade.
Yes.
That obviously a lot of Jewish merchants trafficked in slaves, and that was the norm at the time. And you would have a situation of a Jewish man far away from any Jewish community, and he would find one of his slave women most attractive, and either she would be compelled or she would want to convert,
and of course
raise their children as Jewish.
And of course there are ways there, and of course it in the part about welcoming the stranger, it prescribes how you're supposed to treat someone in that situation. So that makes sense. And that's just nature taking its course too. Even without the Even without the slavery, you've got to figure that's going to happen on some level, just because people are people. A great science fiction writer with horrible politics had the great line, the English language is the product of Norman men-at-arms trying to make dates with with Anglo-Saxon barmaids, and as a result, it's a bastard too.
That's funny.
But I mean, so that's just nature taking its course and turning into the English language. But yeah, and at the same time,
what you'd call dirty words were mainly from the Anglo-Saxons.
There is no. Yes, that's right. Which is funny because that's also where "pardon my French" comes from. If someone was having a conversation in the local Anglo-Saxon dialect, but then all of a sudden started talking Norman, pardon my French.
Makes sense. Where would you want to go from here?
Well, we should probably talk about Essequibo some.
Yeah.
Because I'm heartened by the meeting. I'm glad to see that Maduro and the president of Guyana met in person. And I'm glad to see that we're seeing diplomacy happen. Though the people I've been watching and whose analysis I've been relying upon have been saying that they were pretty sure that we were going to see some attempt to try to not actually go to war, because the actual war would be disastrous for Venezuela too.
Venezuela's not capable of waging that war.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why. First of all, it's the geography. The part of Venezuela that borders on Essequibo just isn't hospitable. You can't move a large army through there.
Yeah, and there's no infrastructure there to make it easier.
There's no infrastructure. There are no roads. It's mountainous. It's jungled. You could possibly move infantry platoons on foot.
But then that turns into a really ugly, really high casualty.
But then you have to supply them.
Yeah. And that
so that's the only reasonable way they could invade is a highway that goes through Brazilian territory,
which Brazil has already said they're not going to cooperate with.
Well, Brazil is moving troops to that highway to make sure that the Venezuelans don't try to go through.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have ultimately you have the United States siding with Guyana,
which is kind of ironic when you consider
they wouldn't need very much to deter the Venezuelans.
Well, no, because I mean it's really easy from a logistical point of view for a power with a navy to move troops into a country with as much coastline as Guyana.
Right, as well as air power and the power to drop paratroops and all of that.
Yeah. Though, as something
from Maduro, it's talk. It's talk.
Dropping paratroops without any other support is usually a huge mistake. There's a reason that some of the highest casualties on D-Day were the paratroopers who went behind the lines first, because paratroopers can't do much without infantry support and armored support. And if you just drop paratroopers somewhere and they can't very quickly take a strong point that you can then get more conventional troops to, they take extraordinarily high casualties.
Well, they could do that in the interior of Essequibo.
Yeah, and
there are settlements.
Yes. Well, and most of those settlements have made their wishes to remain Guyanese pretty clear too.
Very much so.
Both the Afro-Guyanese people and the indigenous people in Essequibo.
That's right.
And it's worth noting that when this argument started the first time, Venezuela was reactionary and Guyana was communist. And at the time, Cuba supported Guyana.
That's right.
And Castro was offering to mediate, and the Venezuelan president was making noises about not accepting mediation and going to the International Court of Justice instead. And a diplomat from the UN quietly said, if you go to the ICJ, you'll lose.
And now it's at the ICJ.
And the Venezuelan government at the time decided to drop the demand, but keep the claim and just stick the claim in a drawer for later to avoid the ICJ saying outright that Essequibo wasn't Venezuelan.
Right.
And I think that's interesting because, again, at the time, this was the early days of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. It was much
under
more
Chetty Jagan.
Yes. And it's interesting how it's turned around, but the claim is still being used to saber rattle.
Right. Hugo Chavez never renounced the claim, but he said that it wasn't worth pursuing because Venezuela and Guyana were fraternal countries,
mm-hmm.
and that territory wasn't worth fighting over.
Yes, which makes sense.
Right, it was sensible.
And fighting over it would just cause massive casualties. But of course, the thing that has changed since then is the Exxon and oil. And when when there's suddenly oil in a place, everybody wants it.
Right. One of Exxon's partners is a Chinese company.
Of course. That's interesting. It doesn't shock me.
No. Well, I think even though Maduro visited China and they signed a bunch of agreements, I think there are realistic people in China who have had Venezuela up to here.
Well, I mean, so what?
Because they've had such bad experiences even trying to help Venezuela.
Well, China is better. While China has done a very good job of making their venture into international capitalism work for their people in a semi-socialist context,
right?
It should be remembered that China still participates in international capitalism, and that Chinese capitalists are still capitalists. They just have a little they have less
leeway.
Reign. The Chinese government will take steps if their capitalists make them look bad.
Well, yeah, and if they try to take over,
yes, but
they won't allow that.
But Chinese businesses operating in places like Venezuela and Guyana and Samoa.
And a lot of them have state. The state has stakes in a lot of those countries.
Yes, well, the state has stakes in almost all of them. That's one of the legal weapons they use to be able to keep people on a short rope. I work in
control the banks.
Yes,
they control the banks.
Yes, and the capital is state capital in China, which is something that American billionaires are very afraid of. I had a conversation in 2020 with a state assemblyman in New York named Ron Kim, and we were talking about COVID relief at the time. And what he was saying is that everybody on Wall Street, New York State Assemblyman, his district is in Queens. He knows a little bit of what he's talking about. All the interests in Wall Street that really sort of drive New York policymaking are really scared of state capital because they saw COVID relief as proving that the state could produce enough capital to make Wall Street obsolete. And if the state actually did any of the things that people were talking about, like the $2,000 a month checks and the actual 3-week quarantine to try to actually stop the increase of cases, as opposed to just killing the curve, those things would have shown that Wall Street was obsolete and the government could do all that stuff. And so they were desperately opposed to the government proving that this could be done, because there would be no reason for Wall Street if the government could do this, because the state could just supply all the capital, like in China.
It's interesting how so many leftists really take that stand against public health, against the government intervening against the pandemic, and really against the germ theory.
So this
and they know who they are.
Well, and how much of the history of that do you know?
The history of
the anti-vax movement and the anti-public health movement and sort of the germ theory isn't real movement.
I couldn't say I'm an expert.
It's funny because there is something called German New Medicine. And the inventor of German New Medicine was someone who was around the fringes of the Nazi medical establishment, but who was not a big enough fish to be swept in. And German New Medicine is just this this fancy sounding approach to healthcare that ignores what we would think of as germ theory and focuses instead on health and wellness and holistic medicine and all the other stuff that you see in the anti-vax movement and the anti-public health movement, and what Max Blumenthal called the healthcare freedom movement.
Right.
Which is really a sneaky, to me, healthcare freedom is the freedom to go to a doctor, not the right to ignore a pandemic.
Right.
I don't understand this notion that healthcare freedom is the right not only to not get healthcare yourself, but to deny the public's interest in health.
Right.
And
well, me and Max go back a while around Venezuela.
Yeah, when the first time you were on, we had a conversation about his decision to go into the nicest neighborhood in Caracas to make a point that the sanctions weren't actually hurting Venezuela and ignoring all the poor people in the same city who were being hurt by the sanctions.
Right. Him and Abby Martin.
Abby seems to have broken away from him a little bit.
I know, but she blocked me when I called her out on it.
And that's fair. And Ben Norton seems to have broken away from Max too, but they're both still. But Ben was still sort of following the what I find inexplicable Venezuela is a revolutionary state line.
Yeah.
Which, I mean,
the wish is father to the thought.
I understand institutional communist support for Cuba and China and North Korea. And the reason I understand it is because no state is perfect. Cuba and North Korea are countries that have undergone have paid tremendous prices to preserve a socialist system.
Right.
At the expense of giving up a lot of international privileges.
I'm going to have to cut out for a little while. I could come back.
Okay.
You give me a few minutes.
I can do that. I'll try to keep talking well.
Okay, good. I'll be back in a little bit.
Where was I? I had a moment there. So I understand the support for Cuba and China and North Korea because those are communist countries who are paying a price to keep their socialist system and to keep working towards their ultimate goals at some point in the future. But then you also see Venezuela and Iran and Russia being given this recognition as somehow being revolutionary states when Russia is a right-wing neoliberal capitalist country. The only reason that they're in conflict with the capitalist order is because they think they should have more energy markets, and they feel like they're being deliberately shut out of Europe and European markets by American capital. And they're looking for ways to build their own alternatives to Western capital as a result. But they're not socialist. Nobody in the Russian government or in Putin's administration claims to be socialist. The Communist Party of Russia is technically the parliamentary opposition to the coalition that supports Putin. And we don't listen to the Russian Communist Party very much unless they're agreeing with Putin on something like Ukraine, which is understandable under the circumstances, but not necessarily. But Putin isn't a communist, and everything he says he's doing in Ukraine isn't all there is to it. He's still the leader of a capitalist state trying to renegotiate his position in the world capitalist empire. And of course, in Venezuela and Iran, the communist parties of those countries are in opposition to the state. Both the Communist Party of Iran and the more traditional Communist Tudeh supported and led and participated in uprisings against hijabs a few years ago, while American communists were condemning those same uprisings and supporting the Iranian state. And it led to a lot of arguing and division because of the view that Iran is a revolutionary state and should be protected without really deeply examining the material conditions of Iran, the relationships between Iran and Western capital, or the fact that ultimately Iran is a capitalist state whose economy is built on Western fossil fuel markets. Iran has done a lot to try to change that. But that started under the Shah, who was also not a communist and who was thrown out by the existing government because the United States thought the Shah cared more about OPEC than about being a good American flunky. That's the reason they let him be overthrown. That and the fact that somebody in Jimmy Carter's State Department had a really, really good impression made on him by Ayatollah Khomeini when he visited him in Paris, and came back to tell Jimmy Carter that Khomeini was saintly, with the word saintly carrying a great deal of weight with someone as religiously oriented as Jimmy Carter. And these things matter because it was the decision, okay, let's throw the Shah over and let someone else take over, that led to the present contradictions of Iran. And it was allowed to happen because of perceived U.S. benefit. And ever since, Iran has been a number one enemy of the U.S. It's just strange how these things work. And then in Venezuela, as Eugene said the last time he was on the show, a lot of the budget of Venezuela was going to buying off anti-Chavista groups so that they would cooperate with the ruling coalition. And as a result, a lot of the progressive programs of the Chavez administration that did happen were paid for by colonels out of their budgets or their pockets in order to try to do something for the people that they were in charge of administering. But the revolutionized military was never used to create a workers' state or even what Lenin called a workers' and peasants' state.
Thanks for your patience.
Oh, that's my pleasure. And really, you would think that the first thing you would do in a liberal framework, if you actually were elected to power as part of a genuine revolutionary coalition, the first thing you would do, in my opinion, is institute constitutional reforms and land reforms to institute worker and peasant democracy and weaken the power of the capitalists. And that didn't happen.
I think that probably was Chavez's intention, but I think he had too much going against him.
There's
In
too many
fact,
things happening at the same time. Yeah.
he even said at one time he made a comparison to the biblical story of the children of Israel in the desert, that it would have to take another generation of Venezuelans to really change the country because the old mentality was too strong.
But the trouble about waiting for the next generation, though, is that the old generation starts to take power back, even if the ruling party doesn't change.
Well, I don't think he meant to wait, but
I know what you mean.
He didn't think it could really succeed, go all the way.
Sure, but that's part of the problem. People who don't try because they think they can't succeed are one of the reasons nothing happens.
Well, he had a lot of plans.
He did. Well, yes.
And actually, some of the things that did come into effect were not through the Venezuelan state, but through the National Oil Company, PDVSA. Yes. They opened discount stores in poor neighborhoods.
Yes.
And they sponsored health clinics and things like that directly because it couldn't work out through the state.
But then there was also the big mess where they lost control of Citgo to U.S. capitalists, and a bunch of oil execs fled the country during that process.
Well, that's after Chavez died.
Yeah, that was Maduro, wasn't it?
That was Maduro. It's interesting about Maduro is he made a big speech about how there was going to be a scientific investigation because he thought that Chavez was assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
And then 3 days later, Chavez's body was embalmed, and never was an investigation
after all. Which is, that's suspicious.
Very suspicious.
Was he just saying it to try to whip up some excitement for the new government by saying Chavez was assassinated? Or
I can't read his mind, but it's kind of normal over there that projects are announced and promises are made, and no one is actually assigned and made accountable for doing or not doing it.
Sounds like the U.S.
Yeah, but
worse,
and it has a worse impact because there's less to fall back on.
Yes, because people are poorer in the first place unless they're
and the infrastructure is not good and
well, the infrastructure of almost every country in the world that isn't part of the what I would call the imperial core or a close imperial client state is all set up for taking stuff out of their country. I mean, that's one of the reasons that there's not a highway into Essequibo from Venezuela because there was no reason for one. There was reasons to get things to airports.
That's right. That's why in Africa, very often it's easier for a business to do commerce with Europe than with a neighboring country.
Well, even in the same country.
Right. All the stuff to an airport.
All the infrastructure in Niger, I use Niger as an example because of the coup there a while back and because of the stuff happening since that coup in Congo. In Niger, the whole infrastructure is set up to move stuff from the countryside to the city so it can be put on a plane to France, or to move things from the inland to somewhere with a port so it can be put on a boat to France. There is no infrastructure for trucks taking food from the city out to the countryside to build supermarkets.
Right. And you have the thing, China trying to build a rapid rail infrastructure in Venezuela,
Mm-hmm.
and investing enormous amounts of money, and it never getting past really the most preliminary steps, and then
money getting sucked into all sorts of little corruption holes,
and actual material just disappearing, tools and.
That sounds like something. That sounds like the episode of MASH where they have there's a huge pickup in theft to sell medicine on the black market, and at one point a guy turns around and his Jeep is gone, and the tires are. It's just 5 seconds. The guy turns around and the tires are all gone from his Jeep, and you see that sort of thing almost anywhere. You see, well, that was what was going on in Afghanistan until the U.S. left, and while their government couldn't stand. And Chavez, I don't know entirely what to think of Chavez, but it seemed like on the whole he was trying to do good things for Venezuela and neighboring countries.
He never was a dictator that people say he was. And I have an anecdote that can illustrate that. There was a case where a young man was driving his car, and he hit and killed. He was speeding, and he hit and killed an innocent person.
Mm-hmm.
And there was something of an issue of it. And Chavez went on the television to denounce it.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meanwhile, the same individual reported the car stolen.
Mm.
The report was accepted, and the car was in Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
And there was never any consequence. And Chavez was furious, and he was talking about how gasoline was virtually free,
Mm-hmm.
and that mainly benefited people with
cars.
Wealth, with cars, and that he was going to put an end to that. And of course, it never happened. Only now.
And it seems to me like since Maduro has taken power, things have been sort of backsliding away from Chavista projects and towards neoliberalism again. The whole argument over Essequibo seems very much like an attempt to get all the liberal nationalists on one page with the ruling coalition, regardless of whether they agree with the ruling coalition on other stuff or not.
Yeah, well, it seems that it's just about impossible to oppose that claim politically in Venezuela.
It makes sense.
But the Communist Party more or less says what you say, and that it's the claim is valid, but the effort to assert the claim is not.
Yeah, that was the way they put it. It was very interesting. That their statement was extremely interesting. They're saying, on the one hand, yes, there is a legal validity to this claim, but we are opposed to any neoliberal war that only benefits capitalists.
Right.
Which was really clear because, let's face it, the only winner in any sort of conflict between Venezuela and Guyana would be the U.S. when they intervene.
That's right.
And they would intervene on the side of Guyana, which would make things worse in Guyana in all sorts of ways, because the U.S. would start to have even more direct control over the local governments. and there would be U.S. military personnel and CIA people on the ground making decisions instead of local governments. And I don't care how bad a local government is, they will usually always make better and more mature decisions than the U.S. military or CIA, because they understand they have to still run their country, whereas CIA and the military know that eventually they can just leave if they really have to.
Right.
So they're willing to. So Americans are willing to do really horrible things in other countries because if it all goes wrong, they'll just leave.
This is reason to be against U.S. intervention, even in Venezuela, as bad as the government is.
This is why that even though I deplore Putin and deplore the Ukrainian government, I am on a anti-Ukrainian. I have an anti-Ukrainian state position on everything going on in Russia. I am no supporter of Putin, but and I believe that the best thing that could happen is to actually negotiate a peace that gives.
I think it's too late for that. I think the Russians have won. It's all over, but the shouting.
Yeah, pretty much. The Donbass is. We're not going to see the denazification of the Donbass that we were hoping for. I don't think. But it's at least. Well, I can't even say at least because the Nazis made sure that the Russians had to destroy Mariupol to take it. And I am in no way removing the responsibility of the Russians for shooting through human shields. They made that decision. But there is really fascinating UN reports from Mariupol about how Azov really was doing exactly what Israel accuses Hamas of doing. Putting bases in hospitals, holding locals hostage as protection for themselves and to accuse the Russians of atrocities later. Now, that doesn't justify blowing up the hospital anyway, but it's really important to remember that this is like one of the few examples we've ever seen of anyone really doing that. Lots of people have accused their enemies of doing that, but nobody's ever been proven to have really done that before. But the Ukrainian Nazis did that.
Yep. You notice the International Court of Justice indictment of Putin?
Yes.
For taking 8,000 Ukrainian children out of the battlefront.
Yes.
And bringing them to safety in Russia. Whereas Israel has murdered at least 8,000 Palestinian children.
Of course,
minimally.
The Ukrainians Ukrainian PR machines have been from the beginning taking 8,000 kids with relatives in Russia out of the battlefield and putting them with their Russian relatives is somehow a huge, huge atrocity.
And the Russians have actually allowed the Ukrainian parents to visit the kids or even stay there if they want to.
Yes. And there's the people.
I'm not so sure that Putin is as bad as you think.
I have problems with Putin, but at the same time, Putin is someone who, if you talk to a Russian,
they love him.
If you talk to a Russian, Russians think Putin has done well by Russia.
Which he has.
He has. There are all sorts of things. There are all sorts of things that one can question, but ultimately, the real problem is capitalism and the fact that the systemic changes create the systemic changes, and then the decision to block the new capitalist country out of the markets that it would need to survive as a capitalist country is there's no reason for it except to make a Canadian capitalist and American capitalist richer. Finding out how much of the business in Ukraine is owned by Canadians was really educational for me. Canada has massive capital interests in Ukraine.
Well, there's a big Nazi Ukrainian diaspora in Canada.
Yeah, and the U.S.
Yeah, but I think they centered more in Canada, actually.
Well, so they're yes and no. They're very organized in Canada. Before World War II, both Calgary in Alberta and parts of New York City and the suburbs already had significant Ukrainian populations. And those significant Ukrainian populations were very left-wing and tended to be labor and kind of pro-USSR and definitely for more socialist policy to help people in the inner cities because that's where they lived.
There used to be upstate New York, a resort, a very low-cost resort for working people that was run by Ukrainian members of the Communist Party called Arrow Park.
Yes.
But I think due to taxes and things like that, they eventually had to sell.
Well, the reason that that all these Ukrainians with Nazi ties were settled in Calgary, specifically in Canada, is that people wanted an anti-communist faction in those Ukrainian neighborhoods. And by settling Nazis there, they would have reliable Tory votes.
Right. I lived for quite a few years in the East Village, which is one of the centers or was one of the centers of Ukrainian settlement.
In Queens. Queens?
No, in East Village, Manhattan.
No, I know. I know what you're saying. I'm thinking out loud. I apologize because I thought of something else. There used to be in Queens every year, maybe I'm getting the location wrong, but they used to have a big celebration for Captive Nations Day. Now, for anybody who doesn't know what Captive Nations Day is, during World War II, there were a whole bunch of people who had supported the Tsar and didn't like the communists who supported the Nazis against the communist government. These groups, the biggest group is the one that everybody knows about, which is the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which basically wrote, even though everybody talks about how tiny the actual Nazi parties are, it's very important to understand that the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists created the entire modern framework for Ukrainian statehood, and that it was anti-communist, anti-Jewish, and anti-Polish. It was also anti-liberal. The first people who were killed by the Order of Ukrainian Nationalists were not Poles, were not Jews, were not Russians, were not Germans. The first people killed by the Order of Ukrainian Nationalists were Ukrainian liberal politicians in the government of the Second Polish Republic. They were deliberately targeting their political enemies to avoid, in order to prove in order to make themselves the only option for independence.
The only thing I want to say is that I'm 77 years old. I lived in New York City with very few interruptions until I was 74.
Yeah.
And I drove a taxi.
Yeah.
All over the city: Queens, Brooklyn, Bronx, Staten Island, Manhattan. And I never heard that there was a big Ukrainian neighborhood in Queens, but I'm going to look it up.
That's interesting because they used to that was where the big Captive Nations Day celebration was.
Well, they may have had it in Flushing Meadow Park or something, but I don't think that was their neighborhood. I'll check it. I'm going to check it up.
Fair. I know that Roman Zvarich, who was the co-founder of the Constitutional, the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists, which was founded by himself and the widow of Bandera's sidekick, Stetsko, was born in Flushing after his parents were settled there by the U.S. Army. And he went back in 91 and gave up his citizenship. Another guy who was born in Flushing under similar circumstances worked for the Heritage Foundation and met the founder of the Ukrainian People's Movement during the late 80s, early 90s, while the Heritage Foundation was the number one funder of both the Ukrainian People's Movement and the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, which were the biggest anti-communist parties in their respective Soviet republics, and which were almost entirely unreconstructed Nazis. And so when we say, well, the Nazi parties are such a small part of the government, you're not talking about the Ukrainian People's Movement, which was funded by the Heritage Foundation through the whole Cold War. If you're getting money from the American Nazis and you're glorifying Ukrainian Nazis, how can you say you're not a Nazi party?
That's right.
But I just
I think it's in Russia's interest to disenfranchise that whole bunch.
Well, Zvarit,
if they're able, they will.
Denazification is what that would mean. So I certainly hope so.
Another thing I wanted to mention was a comparison of the military-industrial complex in the West and in Russia.
Yes.
Because Russia spends a minimal fraction compared to the West. And they produce more artillery, more shells, more tanks, more implements of war. And that's why they've overwhelmed everything that NATO could supply to Ukraine. And that's why they're winning. And the difference is the military-industrial complex in Russia is largely state-owned, and the parts that aren't are state-dominated. And that their mission is to produce what the generals tell them they need. Whereas in this country, it's the other way around.
Well, and worse than that,
they tell the generals what they need. And they because of the political system, they have to set up different factories and subcontractors in different political districts.
So that everybody can get a piece of the pie.
Everyone gets a piece of the pie, and it doesn't matter if the damn thing works or it doesn't.
The F-35 cannot fly in the rain.
Perfect example.
When people were talking about sending F-35s to Ukraine, and as you know, that's Europe is like the worst place to try to fly an F-35. You know, in the Top Gun movie, they talk about how they're going to have to use older jets and not the F-35 because they can't fly the F-35 where they're going because it's not the Middle East, basically. Which is to say, we spent billions and billions of dollars on an airplane that's only useful in the desert.
And then the F-16, it's the opposite, or at least according to what I've heard from Scott Ritter, who I don't have a lot of agreement with, but I think is an expert.
Yeah.
And what he says is that the F-16 needs a perfectly clean runway.
Mm-hmm.
No dirt, no cigarette butts, no nothing. Because the F-16, when it takes off, the intake, the jet engine intake, if the slightest impurity enters the intake, it can't fly.
Makes sense.
And so what he was saying is that if the Ukrainians get the F-16, they would have to fly them from bases in Romania and Poland, because there's no runway in Ukraine that hasn't been destroyed, or even if it's rebuilt, it doesn't meet the standards.
But we want to send them F-16s anyway
Right.
because it's
And so
money.
his point was that if Romania and or Poland allow Ukrainian pilots to take off from their territory to do combat with Russians, then they've become belligerents.
Yeah.
And if they've become belligerents, the Russians are within rights as far as international law and the
Yes.
laws of
To shoot
war
back.
to attack those bases,
Yep,
not just
because
the
those are
planes.
because those bases are sending the planes into their territory. Yes, and
So
I almost wonder if that isn't the reason that the right wing Polish government suddenly started changing tack and being less friendly to Ukraine, leading to their downfall and being replaced by Western flunky Donald Tusk.
right. The other thing was a dispute about exports of Ukrainian grain
Mm-hmm.
into Poland. That
It always,
the Polish agriculture is still very important in Poland, and the farmers
yeah,
objected to foodstuffs coming in from Ukraine,
you can see that.
and there actually were truckers blockading border
I
crossings.
remember that. And I also, which makes sense.
Also, Ukrainians acting obnoxiously in Poland.
Yes. And of course, I don't know I don't know enough about internal Polish politics, but did Law and Justice ever do at any point in their history ever do any grandstanding about the communist theft? I know that used to be the popular word for it among the right wing Poles during the Cold War. The communist theft of West Ukraine.
I don't know if they ever did anything.
Because I mean that was really big for a lot of those people for a lot of those folks in the right wing in Poland during the Cold War wanting East Galicia back.
I'm sure that at least theoretically that would be their position.
Which would make it difficult for them to support Ukraine in the long term, even if they're both anti-communist and pro-Nazi in the short term.
Right.
But knowing that the bases would have had to be in Poland and Romania also makes sense, because it wasn't too long after people started saying we're sending the F-16s that there started to be issues on the Polish side.
Right. And
maybe
also,
that was going on behind the scenes.
Because it seems that Russia has hypersonic missiles that make American anti-aircraft irrelevant.
Well, I mean, and of course the dirty secret is that the American missile defense systems have never been very good at shooting down missiles.
That's right. That's another thing that Ritter mentions, because one of his many jobs in his past was assessing the success of the American anti-aircraft, anti-missile
missiles in the first Gulf War. I remember that.
In Iraq and in Israel.
Well, my ex-best friend in Israel once told me that they didn't actually use any of the Patriots the U.S. gave them. They used their own missile defense system, and they said they were using the Patriots in order to make the U.S. look good.
Makes sense.
I don't know if that's true or whether that's propaganda.
The Patriot, it didn't help. It didn't help the Saudis against the Houthis when they attacked Saudi refineries and oil fields.
No, not at all. And since you mentioned the Houthis, can we all acknowledge that there is at least one country that has gone to war with Israel on the side of the Palestinians, and that's
right.
Yemen.
Right, and they don't even have full control over the country.
And yet, so far in all their engagements with the IDF, they're winning.
Yep. And they forced the four largest shipping companies to abandon commerce in the Red Sea.
which is a huge deal.
It's very significant for Israel's economy. Although what's happened now is that the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia are opening up land routes
Of course.
for supplies to still reach Israel, while they make these impassioned speeches in the United Nations.
Yeah. It's such a mess. Let me put this in here again since it's been a while.
I think.
Oh, it's not the one. That's the one.
Oh, and we can talk about the three Israelis hostages who were released or had been who had escaped, who were shot
Got
dead by
killed by
the
the
IDF.
IDF. We should mention that because
Two of them being soldiers in the IDF, and one being a civilian of military age.
Yeah, and so that's not. And I was looking at some of these. Well, the Israelis shot them because they thought they were Hamas terrorists.
Right, with
Everyone
their shirts off, yelling in Hebrew, rescue us," while waving a white flag.
And yeah, I saw
which
that.
shows what Israel is doing to Palestinians.
Yeah, and how difficult it is, despite the Israelis' claim otherwise, to really target your. Well, let's put it even. They want the high death count. When the IDF says that every dead Israeli and every dead Palestinian is a win for Hamas, what they really mean is every dead Palestinian and every dead Israeli is a win for us, because we can blame it on Hamas.
Well, this one they can't get away with it.
They'll keep trying.
It's caused something of an uproar in Israel.
I bet. But did you see that we're still trying to protect them, though? An American bigot associated with Moms for Liberty was trying to claim, oh, they shot them because they were wearing hijabs. Everybody with a hijab is a target. That's good to know.
Were they?
That's what she was claiming, that the Palestinians put hijabs on hostages when they took them out of the buildings. Well, I don't know if it's true or not. It's just
they might have done that when they were moving from north to south, but not in this instance.
Yeah, no, they weren't. The only person who said that is the American right winger trying to defend the IDF. Somebody else, innocent victims of Hamas terrorism. No, two of them were in the military,
right?
Which makes them war criminals.
Inarguable, legitimate targets of Hamas.
Yeah, and let's go one more, because it's useful to know this too. The Palestinian, while Hamas is the largest group and is not aggressively challenged for leadership right now, Hamas is not the entirety of the Palestinian resistance, or even the entirety of the chain of command of the Palestinian resistance. That's
why they didn't know where all the hostages were.
Exactly. And communist groups like the PLF and DLF, no, I'm sorry, PFLP and DFLP, my apologies. The PFLP and DFLP are communists and have a very different worldview than Hamas, which is not as radically Islamic as it is sometimes accused of being. And there's a real, when the media says Hamas over and over again, it's a dog whistle. They're using the word, they're associating all Palestinians with Hamas in order to justify the huge death toll.
Whereas in reality, Hamas offered back in 2008 to accept a 10-year truce with Israel to
Yes.
accept the 1967 borders.
Yes.
And Jimmy Carter tried to bring this to the attention of the State Department, and they rebuffed him.
Yep. That's right. Because no, we don't want that. That was all war on terror framework, and we were using that war on terror framework to support all our friends against their enemies. One of the biggest expenditures during the war on terror, which we didn't hear about very much, though every now and then someone would run something about it if there were hostages. But one of the biggest expenditures of the war on terror was a war in the backwoods of the Philippines between the Philippines government and breakaway communists. And we were sending as much money there and to Russia fighting Chechens in Chechnya and to China fighting Uyghur separatists as we were to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. But now all of a sudden China is genociding the Uyghurs that we were paying them to fight, we say.
Right.
It's weird how all that works. First, they're fighting the war on terror for us, and now they're committing a genocide. We need to make up our minds.
Well, they're not committing a genocide.
No. The best way,
the most were.
Well, it's really important to understand that Wahhabism is not part of the Uyghur culture, that the Uyghurs are not culturally Arab in the way that many attempts to describe the genocide have attempted to depict them.
The
Uyghurs do not wear the reason that certain clothes were banned is because the Uyghurs do not wear those on a normal basis, and wearing those sorts of clothes was a way for Saudi influenced pro Al-Qaeda groups to identify themselves. And so it's kind of funny that we're calling this part of cultural genocide against the Uyghurs when no, that's a cultural import from Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan. Sorry, we've been walking through a few rabbit holes, I think. But I really appreciate your time in the conversation. Is there anything we should definitely hit before we wrap up? Because we're coming in on the 2-hour mark.
I think we've covered everything that I'm ready to do.
That's fair. I do want to say, just as sort of a final, that I will be off for the Sundays of Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. So this is the last show of this year. I will be coming back the second Sunday of January. So, folks, don't worry if you don't see anything posted about the show for a couple of weeks. I'm taking the holidays off.
I just wanted to mention one thing I remember.
Go for it.
That, I'm a volunteer at the Mutual Aid Richmond. And they have a store which I volunteer in, which provides free food, no questions asked, no forms to fill out, to anyone who says they need it. Period. And
need more of.
I'm gonna have that mentioned on my Substack. And if people want to either avail themselves of it, or contribute to it, or volunteer for it, I'll have the information on my Substack.
That's great. And folks, check out his Substack. It is right here in the banner in the show. It's worth a follow.
Thanks very much. I'm going to take off now, okay?
Have a great day, Eugene. Thanks for joining us. And everybody else, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, always.
Take care.
Take care. And everybody else, thanks for joining us too. And we will tweet at you.